The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
If democracy is the search for what the people decide is the common good, why does it depend so much on clashes among political parties? Tonight, as part of our joint TVO Toronto Star initiative, we're asking if party politics does more harm than democratic good. First up, we'll hear from Preston Manning, founder of the Reform Party and a politician who shook up the Canadian party system as few others have, on making Canadian politics better. It's Thursday, April 15th, and that's tonight on the Democracy Agenda. One of the biggest shakeups in Canadian political history took place in the 1990s when the Reform Party went from 1 seat to 2.5 million votes and 52 seats in the 1993 election. The vision for that new, more populist, more Western Canada-focused party came from Preston Manning. 2 months shy of his 79th birthday, Mr. Manning is still trying to improve Canadian democracy and has some ideas in his latest book, Do Something: 365 Ways You Can Strengthen Canada, and it brings the founder and first leader of the Reform Party back to our airwaves from... Where are you, Mr. Manning? You in Edmonton or Calgary?
I'm in Calgary. I'm in Calgary, Steve.
You are in Calgary. Good to have you back on our program again.
Thank you.
I do want to start by pointing out that The Economist magazine does this Democracy Index survey every year, and apparently of all the countries in the whole world, Canada came out 5th best, which is not first best, but 5th is not bad. On the other hand, you write, democracy in Canada, defined as government of the people, by the people, and for the people, is in deep trouble. What are you seeing that The Economist isn't?
Well, I guess one of the main things is just the disillusionment of Canadians, the disrespect of democratic processes, democratic institutions, politicians in general. I keep in touch with some of the pollsters, Steve, that we used to work with in the political business, and I've kept asking them during this COVID crisis, is there a flicker of concern on the part of the public that the parliament was virtually shut down, that some of the legislatures have been virtually shut down or have had meaningless sessions? And they say there's not a flicker of concern. In fact, one of them said, I don't think the House of Commons could be shut down for 2 or 3 years, or it could be shut down for 2 or 3 years, and I don't think Canadians would even notice, let alone care. So I think there's a deeper problem, a much deeper problem than what The Economist picked up.
What does that speak to in your view?
Well, to the politicians and the political parties, and I've been involved with those all my life, I think we need to strengthen the knowledge and skills of the political practitioners and the trustworthiness of them. Years ago, we did a national survey asking people, Canadians, what's most important to you, that a candidate or an elected official be knowledgeable, that they know something about this and that and the issues and so forth, that they have certain skills, communication skills, decision-making skills, representation skills, or that they have certain character traits, honesty, integrity, trustworthiness. And predictably, character trumped knowledge and skills, very, very much so. People saying, I don't care how knowledgeable or how skillful a person is, if I can't trust them because of certain characteristics or a lack of them, then the rest doesn't matter. So I think there's a lot that has to be done to strengthen the character, the knowledge, and the skills of political practitioners if you want to restore public confidence in our form of democracy.
Where would you put that lack of confidence the public has in the system and in those it elects to do its business in terms of an explanation for why voter turnout has gone inexorably down over the last many decades?
Well, I think you're putting your finger on one of the indications that people are not participating in the process because they don't think it does any good. And so these factors that I'm talking about, strengthening the knowledge, skills, the character of the political practitioners, is necessary to win back that confidence. When I left the Parliament, Steve, that was 2001, 2001, a while back. I did a survey. I talked to the speakers and the clerks of the House of Commons, the 10 provincial legislatures, and a couple of the territorial assemblies. And I said to them, you've seen hundreds of elected people come through your assembly and often not prepared for the job as well as they could be. What would you suggest in terms of courses or training that might raise the knowledge and skills and therefore the confidence of the people in the assembly? And they gave me this list of 30 things, all the way from protocol to small office management to communications. Incidentally, lawmaking. They said nobody teaches them lawmaking, and these people are the only people that can make statute law. And I actually took that list to Carleton University, and Carleton developed this Riddell graduate program in political management to try to meet some of those training needs. I took it to UBC, and UBC developed this Summer Institute for Future Legislators, and they're working on a democracy house that would be a 100-seat replica of the House of Commons, where you could provide heavy-duty training to better prepare people for elected office if that's what they seek to do. And I think that's one of the things could be done to strengthen the political class so that people have more confidence in it.
I noted that recommendation in your book with great interest because it's amazing, at least it's been amazing to me over the years, that people can be superstars in their chosen fields and yet leave that behind, go into politics where they know absolutely nothing about anything, about how the whole political system works, and yet we do that over and over and over again. Why have we not figured this out yet?
I don't know. Maybe we haven't talked about it enough, and that's what I'm trying to do in this book. The other thing that would help this, Steve, is the parties developing much stronger recruitment processes for recruiting people into public life in the first place. My wife Sandra and we have 13 grandkids, a third of them boys that play hockey, a couple of them at fairly high levels. And so we've been to an infinite number of hockey games. And you go to these arenas, not during the COVID time, but before, 6:30 in the morning. And if you look at the back row on the seats, there's a couple of grizzled old guys with clipboards. Who are these grizzled old guys with clipboards watching 11 and 12-year-olds play hockey? They're scouts. Some of them are scouts with NHL connections, scouting 12-year-olds to see if there's somebody that shows a talent that if you gave them more training, better opportunities, experience, maybe they could play the national game at the highest level. Where's our political equivalent of that? Who's out scouting the next generation to find young people with some of the character traits, skills, potentially, that could be cultivated and developed? I think we need that scouting capacity if we want to raise the qualifications of the political class.
I wonder, though, whether you think politics has become so discredited and our democracy lies in such disrepair at the moment that anybody who is, quote unquote, of quality will surely choose another profession to go into rather than politics. Are we there yet?
Well, that's very true. And I've been involved in candidate recruitment all my life, provincially and then federally. And the biggest single reason given now, and I've heard this reason expressed in the last 6 months, of why some quality person with a lot to give, if you could ever get them there, says, I won't touch it. And the main reason they give, and this touches a little bit on your business, Steve, but they say, I will not put up with the abuse that I will get from the mass media and particularly from the social media. And more importantly, I will not submit my family to the abuse that you get today in the political arena, particularly in this polarized environment. And that's a very hard thing to counter. If somebody raises financial things, you can answer that. If they raise other concerns, you can usually answer that. But that one of just people finding the political arena corrosive from a personal standpoint, the impacts on their family, it's very hard to rebut that objection.
Well, on the other hand, I have talked to politicians as well who say they acknowledge, of course, the family price one pays, the lack of privacy, the constant on social media attacks and so on. And I've heard some say, yeah, that happens, but it's a relatively small price to pay for having the opportunity to have your hands on the levers of the country's agenda or the province's agenda or whatever for a period of time. Is that deal no longer worth it anymore?
Well, no, I think there are people that will say that, and then they are not so disincentivized as to not throw their hat in the ring. But I hear far more of this other argument that I won't touch it because of the negative impacts on my family. I come from a political family. One of the ways of coping with all that abuse is develop a hard shell so that it doesn't get to you. You don't pay any attention. Now, there's a danger in that. My father had that shell. I had that shell. The danger in that is you develop such a hard shell that certain emotional messages and that should get through to you don't get through. So even the defense mechanisms for coping with the corrosive environment, if you're not careful, they can turn out to be a liability as much as an asset.
Just for those who don't know, your father was Premier of Alberta back in the day, and we just remind everybody of that. I would love you to humor me for just a second, because I want to put a theory to you and get your view on it. And this goes back to voter participation, which we talked about earlier in our interview. I know that you believe that a high voter turnout is a sign that a democracy is thriving and that people want to participate and are engaged. However, in the last U.S. presidential election, they had a record number of people participating and very much engaged. And I'm not sure it was an indication of how healthy and thriving democracy was. I think you could make an argument that people saw it as a sign that the apocalypse would be upon them if the other side won. And that's what brought them to the polls, because they thought the potential for the country going through some kind of existential crisis is too high not to participate. Now, that's a very different argument from voter engagement and voter participation are the same thing. Fair to say?
Yes, but I think the factor there, Steve, is that if the high voter turnout is fed by this polarization, by people getting into absolute warring camps, and if I don't get out there, the other guy will win and he'll destroy the country. If that's what's motivating the increase in voting, not citizen concern about how to solve certain issues, not concern for advancing certain high-minded values or positions, but this product of extreme polarization, and we can't let the other guys win. If that's what's driving the increased participation, then that's not good. And that's why I think the necessity of addressing this question of extreme polarization in the political arena is important, because in the end, it's a liability, not an asset, even if it does increase a voter turnout.
Okay, let's do a quote from your book here. This is from Do Something. The weakness and danger of state-supported identity politics as currently practiced by the Trudeau administration and others like-minded is that it divides the population and electorate into an increasing number of minority groups distinguished mainly by their differences rather than their commonalities. This makes the reconciliation of conflicting interests and the achievement of a national or provincial consensus on anything increasingly difficult to attain. Do you think identity politics is basically a natural phenomenon in a country as multicultural as Canada, and therefore it just comes with the territory?
If you exploit the division, the point I'm trying to make there is if you exploit the divisions, if you increasingly say it's extremely important to know what your race is, what your gender is, what your cultural background is, what your religious orientation, what your sexual orientation, and depending on what you say to me, then we'll give certain rights to you or certain privileges to you or do certain things for you based on those criteria. I think in the end of the day, that is divisive. And what the approach I would prefer to take is we're all human beings. What are the things we have in common? And what are the things we can therefore advance as entitlements to you, regardless of your race or your culture, your gender, your sexual orientation, rather than because of them. And I think this country can't take its, you know this very well, and I know it. I was in the Parliament. The worst night in my time in Parliament was the night of that Quebec referendum, when the country came within a hair of breaking up. This country cannot take national unity for granted. It's got to, in my view, build on the things people have in common, rather than on these distinctives such as race, culture, gender, and so forth. The other area in this, we mentioned national unity. Half of the national unity problems in this country, in my view, come out of the tension between the federal and provincial governments. And if there's one thing that could be done to change that, and I've not been a big advocate of constitutional amendments because they're so hard to achieve, but one thing that would help that is a constitutional amendment forbidding the federal government from treaty making legislating, spending, or taxing in areas of provincial jurisdiction, such as natural resources, or joint jurisdiction, such as health and the environment, unless it gets the consent of the province affected. I think that would do away with 50% of the federal provincial tensions, and therefore would help unify the country rather than divide it.
Well, of course, they just had a fight about that on the carbon tax, and they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court doesn't agree with you, Mr. Manning. They went with the feds on that one.
No, because there isn't that. If that constitutional amendment that I was talking about was there, the Supreme Court would have had no alternative but to say, yes, the federal government can do what it wants, but it's got to get the consent of the people it affects.
I see. Okay. Well, listen, as long as we're on the issue of the environment, I'm interested. You're a conservative. I think we could say that. You're a conservative. You define your conservatism perhaps a little differently from other conservatives in the country, but you're a conservative. And you have said, since we live in an ever-changing world, both democracy and conservatism need to be periodically realigned in order to adapt to different conditions. And I guess, at the risk of sort of going over some ancient history here, do you think the former Federal Progressive Conservative Party, which of course you helped bring to an end, do you think they missed the boat on that?
Well, I think so, and that's what caused the phenomena that the Reform Party came about mainly as a result of disillusionment with both federal parties in the 1990s, and then we built these coalitions. The Reform built this coalition with the Klein Conservatives provincially, with the Filmon Conservatives in Manitoba, with the Harris Conservatives in Ontario, created the Canadian Alliance, which was a bigger, broader conservative movement. And then Stephen Harper and Peter MacKay took it the one step further, built a coalition between the Alliance and what was left of the old Progressive Conservative Party, and created the new Conservative Party of Canada. And that was done because the old Progressive Conservative Party couldn't adjust to the changing conditions. And I say, you don't want these political realignments every second Tuesday, but I think every decade or so, you need those realignments. In fact, when the Reform Party was created, the lawyer that helped put the Constitution together, I asked him to put a sunset clause in the Reform Party's constitution. It would come to an end 10 years down the road unless it decided to renew itself or renew itself on some other foundation. And I don't think it would hurt for every federal party to have a sunset clause that forces it to rethink its foundations, say every decade or maybe 2 decades.
Does any other political party have that in its constitution?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. Okay. And again, I'm going to follow up on this notion of you as a conservative. Conservatives, by the very nature of the word, they like to conserve. And you would think that there would be some natural environmentalists in a conservative movement that wanted to conserve the planet on which we live. But of course, I hearken back to the Conservative Party of Canada's most recent annual general meeting, in which more than half the people who voted said they don't agree that climate change is for real. What do you clearly understand about a conservative wanting to conserve the environment and the planet that apparently those folks did not?
Well, there are a couple of things there, Steve. First of all, there are all kinds of green conservatives. There are in the Parliament. Michael Chong, Leslyn Lewis. There's a number of green conservatives, mainly among the younger crowd. So the idea that conservation and conservatism are incompatible, the words come from the same root. With respect to that motion, this gets into the whole issue of science denial. And there's been some very interesting work done on that. There's this book, Enlightenment Now, by Steven Pinker from Harvard, that gets into that. And what he says, or he quotes some other experts on it, is that these people that deny certain things about science really haven't gone and studied the science and are denying it because they've studied it backwards and forwards. What they're denying is the political champions of that science, who they disagree with for a dozen different reasons that got nothing to do with the science. And that's what's at the root of that so-called science denial on the right, and it's also on the left. There's dozens of scientific studies that show that the safest, most environmentally responsible way to move large volumes of petroleum long distances is by pipeline. It is not by trains, and it is not by trucks. But left-wing people often ignore that, or even deny it. Why? Because they've studied all these studies on pipeline? No, it's because to identify with it would put them in the same camp as the pipeline people or the conservatives, and they don't want to do that for a dozen reasons. It's got nothing to do with pipeline. So I think further explanations and understandings of the roots of this science denial left and right would be helpful in removing it as a factor from the political arena.
Let me ask you as well about just where you think this party, the Conservative Party of Canada, is these days. I think most small d Democrats would agree that a country works best, a democracy works best when it's got a competent, capable government in place and a competent, capable opposition ready to take over if that's what the people decide the next time out. The Conservative Party of Canada today, is it a competent, capable, ready to govern party in your view?
Well, that's, as you know, in my book, that's the other half of my book, basically, is I think there's a whole bunch of things not only that have to be done to strengthen democracy, but to strengthen conservatism's contributions within it. I use this model in the book of a pyramid where I have the political parties, conservative or whatever, at the top of the pyramid, the elected people who will actually represent whatever in an elected assembly. But underneath it, I have all the components of what I would call as the conservative movement as distinct from the parties, the think tanks that generate intellectual capital, the training programs that train people, the communicators, the advocacy groups, the funders. And I argue that the stronger that movement is underneath the political party, the stronger and more competent and prepared to govern the party will. So I'm spending a lot of time on trying to strengthen the movement because I think that's the way that we strengthen the party. And this is true for every party, not just for conservatives. Mm-hmm.
In our last minute here, I do want to ask you about how concerned you are as we look at democracy writ large, that, for example, the Chinese, with their state-driven so-called democracy, that maybe they're in ascension while our citizen-driven democracy may not be. What's your view on that?
Well, that's a very, you could spend 2 or 3 of your programs on that, Steve. In fact, I'd encourage you to do it. I think the greatest ideological competition of the 21st century is going to be between citizen-directed democracy as practiced, however imperfectly, in the West, versus that state-directed democracy as promoted and believed in by the Communist Party and government of China. And if we're honest, I think we have to say we're losing that battle. I talked to diplomats when I was in the political business from Africa and South America and asked them which of those models. And if they came from a country with somewhat of an authoritarian background, they would look at me and say, which one? When I'd say, which one do you prefer? They would say the Chinese model, of course.
Does that break your heart?
Yes. And again, just for me, it just strengthens this need that we have to strengthen our own version of democracy if we want to be competitive internationally, let alone better off domestically.
Well, people can always go get the book, Do Something, and if they do, they will find 365 ways to strengthen Canada, one for every day of the year. That's the former leader and founder of the Reform Party of Canada, Preston Manning. Mr. Manning, not only are we grateful for the time you spent with us here on TVO tonight, but let me say personally, I'm grateful every time you send me a very critical email about some column I've written, because I always appreciate hearing your point of view. So thank you.
Let's keep it up, Steve. Thank you.
Federal and provincial politics in Canada operate along clear-cut party lines from the campaign trail to the committee room. It's been that way since Confederation, but does that mean it's good for Canadian democracy? Or could it today be acting as more of a liability that amps up feigned outrage, partisanship and division? With us to consider that, in Denholm, Quebec, David Hurley, principal partner at the Gandalf Group and the host of the Hurley Burley podcast. In L'Orignal, Ontario, in Eastern Ontario, Sean Speer, fellow in residence at the Public Policy Forum. And in the nation's capital, David Moskrop, contributing columnist to the Washington Post and author of Too Dumb for Democracy. And Susan Delacourt, national affairs columnist for the Toronto Star, whom we want to thank for going in on this democracy agenda thing. Susan, I think this is our 7th time out the gate with it, and we're really enjoying it very much. And as I welcome everybody to the program tonight, let me just start by saying people often ask me, where do you get your show ideas from? And we, of course, get them from all sorts of places, but sometimes we get them from other shows. What do I mean? Sheldon, if you would.
I distinguish between politics and democracy. I think people don't like politics and don't necessarily believe that democracy is accomplished through politics. But I think they fundamentally believe that their vote counts and that the system should work. I just don't think they think that politics works. And on that, they're correct. Politics is not a great system for delivering democracy.
Politics is not a great system for delivering democracy. Really?
No. I do away with political parties. Myself? That's a whole other story.
That is a different show, but maybe we got to come back to that in a future show. Get rid of all political parties in the country.
Yeah, I like the way municipal governments function. I think the reason that people like municipal governments better is because there's no nonsense. A lot of the political polarization is fake political polarization. It is people deliberately taking extreme views to fit into a political system that doesn't actually, we all don't think the way political parties do.
Okay, Susan, here we are. Another day, another topic. Let's put some meat on this bone. How can you imagine this country or this province operating without political parties? We've been doing it this way since 1867 and before.
Well, I think that every time you ask political people after they're out of politics, and some of the people on this panel would know this well, is what is the worst thing that happened to them when they were in government and when they were serving parties was the party system itself. People, the political system turns everything into something that is not the middle ground, is not, it's not even rational anymore. And you have to be like a human being when you're out of politics, and when you're in politics, you have to be something unhuman.
All right, let me go to David Hurley to follow up, because, David, you've worked for Liberal prime ministers and Liberal premiers, and I wonder whether you can imagine a scenario or whether you'd be prepared to entertain a scenario where deeply partisan politics is no longer a feature of Canadian democracy.
I recognize all that Susan is saying, and there are certainly undesirable outcomes from the party system. And it may be that parties are not able to perform all of the functions that they used to perform. I have a very hard time understanding how it would work and whether it is desirable that it would work. People may, I don't know whether they like their municipal governments more, but I know that they're much less engaged with municipal politics. And I know that the voting turnout rate is much lower in municipal politics. And I think that part of that is that without a party system, people don't, know who they should vote for, and they don't know who's accountable for what. And so let's take the first piece of it. All of the data I've ever seen indicates that about 5% of Canadians really vote on the basis of their local candidate. And that tends to be in rural areas where people know their local candidate. In most parts of the country, people don't even know who the candidates for the parties are. They vote either for the leader or for the policy program of the party. And that is how all of what's going on is decoded for them so that they can make a choice about what they want. Then similarly, if I'm in Toronto and I don't like what's going on, can I blame John Tory for that? He's one vote on the council. The accountability is so obscure, I don't know who to blame. Whereas in a partisan system, when I'm unhappy with the government, I know exactly whose neck to choke. And so I think for those two reasons, I mean, Susan's done a lot more thinking and research about this than I have, but I have trouble seeing how it would work and whether it would be desirable for it to work. Okay, we'll get some more feedback on this and then let Susan respond to what she's hearing. Sean, you're a guy who back in the day spent some time in partisan politics working for Conservatives. Can you imagine a political system in Canada that doesn't involve partisan politics?
Well, the short answer is no. I think that this conversation about problems or weaknesses in our democracy is terribly important. But I'm not sure the solution is to discard parties In fact, I think there's a persuasive argument, in fact, that we ought to have more parties. That one of the problems with the current system is that these large brokerage parties aren't bringing expression to large minorities in our country, whether it's hardcore progressives, whether it's pro-life voices, whether it's those who have misgivings about Canada's immigration system and yet can't find expression in our current mainstream politics. So I could go on, Steve, but I think in short, I've increasingly come to view, and this has been through a kind of period of introspection, prompted in large part by the rise of political populism, which is obviously has various complicating factors, but at some level represents a kind of rejection of the lack of representativeness and responsiveness of modern democracy. And for me, it's made me more of a small d Democrat, and in turn, I think increasingly persuaded by the need for something like proportional representation, which would not lead to fewer parties. It would actually lead to more parties. It would be a less efficient and messier politics, but ultimately a more representative and responsive one. And for me, that's one of the major takeaways of the political disruption of the past several years.
David Moskrop, where are you on this?
Well, if parties didn't exist, you would have to invent them for reasons that David outlined. And incidentally, I happen to agree with Sean on proportional representation. I would love to see some socialists in legislatures. Our parties are all fundamentally liberal, and that does, I think, close out a lot of debate that we should legitimately be having. But if you look at the history of jurisdictions who have tried to do away with parties or to sort of mitigate their force, parties creep back up anyway. The United States is a good example of this. The framers of the Constitution in the United States were weary of what they called factions. They didn't love the idea of parties, but parties crept in anyway because they perform the functions that David talked about, which is they sort of consolidate voices and they allow for accountability. And so the parties form a necessary part of our system. I don't think parties are the fundamental problem. I think parties done poorly is the problem. I think parties that are too leader-centric, parties that are fundamentally identitarian and toxic because of it, they perform a sort of toxic identitarian partisan role rather than a sort of partisan sorting role. And they end up being anti-democratic in that way, are part of the problem. We could do parties better. It doesn't have to be either or. It can we imagine a different sort of party system that works and includes people and is more functional? And I think we can. So I do think we need party reform, but I don't think we should do away with them, nor do I think we could, because they would just sort of reform anyway.
Susan, sounds like you've got, like Terminator, good. So it sounds to me, Susan, like you've got your work cut out for you if you're going to convince these three gentlemen to come your way. So you've heard their complaints. Begin where you like in response.
Okay, well, let me take them on little bit by bit. David Hurley, my good friend, said people aren't engaged with their municipal governments. I would argue that people know what's going on with their municipal governments more than they do their federal political parties. And people are engaged with what people give them. I think that, and to Sean's point about brokerage, I think it's a shame that political parties have stopped being brokerage parties. I too would like a proportional representation system. That's not, and I would like the brokerage to be done, I think, in Parliament as a whole. But the idea now, and we've seen this at several political conventions, that there is any idea of compromise now in political parties. The whole idea of them is to sharpen differences among people rather than to smooth them out and to come to some middle ground. I think normally, as I was saying earlier, normally sane people stand up and say the most outrageous things about what they believe, that they're always right and that everybody else is always wrong. And I just think that's a style of debate that people don't have in their normal lives, that people recognize as fake. It's sort of this, everything is hyperbole for political parties. You know, that you talk to them behind the scenes and they say, well, we don't really believe what, you know, all of that stuff we're saying. We're doing it for the sake of the party and keeping the team together. And I just think there's got to be a better system than the one that people are seeing with their political parties. It does not resemble the kind of political debate that people have in their own lives. and in their own in the bars or around their own dinner tables. What passes for political debate in this country is all about trying to keep a party team together.
David Hurley, would you grant that on the face of it, that is an empirically provable fact? And we have seen tons upon tons of evidence that what Susan just said is absolutely true. Now, you may not like her solution for that problem, but would you grant that the problem she's identified is spot on?
I think, yes, I would, 100%. Do people say things they don't mean in politics? Absolutely. Do parties accentuate some differences that aren't as wide as they might want them to appear to be? They do. And I'm not pretending that our politics is perfect. And I'm not even sure we are pretending to have brokerage parties anymore. The Conservative Party, the modern Conservative Party, the CPC, does not look like a brokerage party to me. It looks like an ideological party. In fact, it looks like a reaction against a brokerage party, which was the PC party, and a desire to have a more ideologically pure instrument on their behalf. Certainly the Liberal Party is not the big tent party it used to be, drawing in people from all walks of life and income streams, etc. It has become a more ideological party. I personally think this is dangerous, because I know we don't want to talk about proportional representation, but I'm in the opinion research business. And one of the things that I know is how divided this country is on core concepts and core ideas, and how easy it would be for this country to splinter. And we should all think back to Meech and Charlottetown and remember that once you strip away the veneer of consensus, there isn't much consensus about the country. And brokerage parties have traditionally filled that space and papered over those differences. And, you know, if you abandon parties that do that, I mean, let me tell you, just to give you an example, you may think the debate in Canada over official bilingualism is settled. It's not. It's just settled among our political parties. And that's just one tiny example of ways in which the country can splinter when you don't have brokerage parties managing these divisions.
David, you're a public opinion guy, and therefore in that interest, we're going to share some public opinion here. These aren't your numbers. This is from Public Square Research. They were in the field last month, and here's what they came up with. On the issue of how happy Canadians are with politics, 61% of those surveyed feel that politics to a greater or lesser extent is broken. 77% say that political parties serve their own interests, not the voters' interests. 75% are frustrated because politicians do not, in their judgment, pay the price for broken promises. And 59% want there to be a way to charge politicians for corruption or gross negligence. Sean, I'll get you to follow up on this. You, as we suggested earlier, have been affiliated with conservative parties going back many decades. Now, admittedly, they're in opposition right now, so perhaps not wholly responsible, or even most significantly responsible for the fact that 6 in 10 Canadians feel to a greater or lesser extent that Canadian politics is broken. But how much responsibility do you think, apropos of what David just said, do you think Conservatives and the party in particular have to assume?
Well, I think it's a pox on everyone's house, to be honest. I mean, the two fundamental roles that political establishment, political elites play are, one, responsiveness, and two, leadership. And those, I think, are in tension. You know, how much you're responding to public interests, public aspirations, public concerns, versus trying to guide and shape the public on different matters. And I think there's a risk, Steve, that we've come to err too much on the question of doing neither very well. David talked about issues being settled by our political establishment. That's kind of what I was getting at in my first answer. It seems to me that those public views don't go away. They remain there under the surface of the so-called political settlement negotiated by our political elites. And I think the experience in the United States shows that that it can ultimately fester and explode in the election of a liberal president. And so it seems to me we need to resist the temptation to try to neglect or ignore these views within our population. Instead, we kind of need to lean into them and make sure that they have voice and expression in our politics. It'll make things messier, I concede that. But it strikes me that that's a better outcome in the long term than letting these different views be neglected by mainstream politics and ultimately explode in the form of political populism or political disruption or indeed illiberalism.
David Moscrop, how do we, though, encourage people to go vote when 6 in 10 think that politics is broken? How do we encourage people to stand for office or put up signs on their lawns or hand out leaflets at doors or stuff envelopes? How do we encourage people to get involved in the political process when 6 in 10 feel it's broken?
Well, the point at which you think you should be pulling back on democracy as a rule is the point at which you should be doubling down on it, but with better institutions. So first of all, let's dig in a little bit to what we're picking up when we're talking about dissatisfaction. I mean, you're picking up more than just irritation with parties there. You're picking up frustration with the system, your economic frustrations. Can people own a home? Can people put their kids through school? How many hours a week are they working? Can they afford their dental care? Can they afford their drugs? You're picking up a lot of deep frustration, the sort of stuff you pick up when you see trust declining. So there's a lot going on there. So there's structural, fundamental things that we need to deal with economically as well as politically. We can't disaggregate the two. But to the extent that we're talking about political participation, we can say, why don't we have things like citizens' assemblies or participatory budgeting, routine sites of engagement for citizens where they can help set the agenda, build civic capacity, and be in regular touch with politicians? Because people hate stuff in the abstract, but lots of folks seem to like their representative. They like to, when they're engaged, when they're drawn into the process, they have good things to say. But when it's abstract and they're alienated from it, they don't. So, I think we ought to develop a culture of participation and engagement, but that requires a transfer of power to some extent to people. It requires better avenues of representation, and it requires material transfers of resources so that people are more or less basically equal, materially as well as symbolically and legally. So if we want to get to the fundamental problems, we need to look at fundamental structural solutions. But we don't really like to talk about that in this country. Instead, we sort of default to, are people being nice or mean on the internet, And so I think we should be having those conversations alongside conversations like this.
Well, we're going to have that conversation right now, and you have very nicely anticipated where I wanted to take us next, because we're going to share some more numbers which deal with this whole issue of power sharing that you've just referred to. Sheldon, next group of numbers if we can. 76% believe that it's very or somewhat possible to change politics for the better. That's very encouraging. 3/4 believe it's possible to change politics for the better. 46% of Canadians believe that better democratic participation can be achieved by letting Canadians vote on major issues. Let's keep going. 64% would prefer to be governed by 100 randomly chosen Canadians rather than the corresponding number of members of a prestigious university faculty. And let's get even a little crazier here. What if our representative democracy was not based on elections, but on a selection of parliamentarians, such as for a jury trial? Would that work? 66% of Canadians said no. Only 34% yes, that it would work. However, 41% say they would want to be selected to be part of such a parliament. All these numbers from Public Square Research once again. Susan, I wonder if you'd just sort of choose to pull up any one of those numbers that you cotton onto there and say, does any of that give you some hope?
It tells me that Canadians, at least the ones surveyed here, are a very populist group, that the populism has arrived here. That I think there's a thread through those results that says that Canadians don't much trust elites who are in power, except the courts, which is a whole other conversation, I guess. But I think those results kind of validate what my colleagues on the panel are saying here in various ways. Is there's the deep distrust of politics is I think tied up with a deep distrust of elites right now in the country, and politicians are deemed to be elites who are out of touch. And to just loop right back, that takes me back to, I think political parties have some blame to take for that.
How is it that, I mean, if you look at the House of Commons, there are a lot of very normal people in the House of Commons. How is it that a pig farmer from Saskatchewan, David Hurley, suddenly becomes an elite when she's elected to Parliament?
Well, she starts to make more money than most people in the country do. She starts to fly business class regularly, and she starts to have power and authority, and that immediately makes her different than she was before, and different than her neighbors back home. But really, I don't think people think of members of Parliament as elites. I don't. I think they think of cabinet and the prime minister as elites and some other significant positions. But somebody mentioned earlier, it might have been Sean, most people actually like their member of Parliament, and think that their member of Parliament's a good person, while still having a belief that the system is widely corrupt. It is amazing. You haven't even scratched the surface in this poll of what people think about politics. Most people think most people in politics are on the take, getting money, enriching themselves some way or another, or advantaging their friends and family. It's terrible if you get beneath it, what people think. But, people have a limited appetite for politics and a limited appetite to fix anything about it. And, citizens' assemblies are going to be attended by hundreds of people. And the millions of people who don't attend them are not going to feel more consulted because hundreds of people went to a citizens' assembly. The truth of the matter is, you only feel properly consulted if the decision mirrors your own point of view. Absent that, there were not proper consultations involved.
So the notion of having a whole bunch of referendums and people getting to vote on issues more frequently, that's not going to help in terms of feeling consulted?
Well, referendi are a different matter. But, I think if you go back to Susan's point about what happens to politics, I think referendums take that to the extreme on every issue. I don't think we've had a positive referendum experience in this country, and I don't know that the referendum over the Charlottetown Accord was a more edifying spectacle than any of our elections are.
Well, Sean, what do you make of the fact that 3/4 of the people surveyed believe that it's possible to change politics for the better? Are you encouraged by that?
Yeah, it's an interesting outcome given some of the other findings in the poll. I would say a couple of things, Steve. First of all, the public's aversion to elites is not just empty populism. I mean, there is something here, right? Business, political, cultural, academic elites who ultimately shape our kind of public discourse and the kind of ideational framework in which we talk about policy and politics and so on, have made some big mistakes in this century. The way we have engaged China in hindsight was a big mistake that we're now trying to correct for. The global financial crisis was a big mistake in which elites were primarily responsible. Frankly, the war in Iraq, David worked in the Preston government. It's one of the few governments around the world that was right on that issue. And of course, the pandemic fiasco that we're seeing in the past several months is another example of elite failure. So I guess my first point is the public has some basis for those findings. The second point I would make, if I can just try to clarify some of the things I said before on this question of political responsiveness and representativeness. My primary concern, having spent time thinking about the political experience across the West in recent years, is how do we ensure that our political system is more representative and responsive of minority views? And I think one of the mistakes that we've made is we've sought out an efficient political system at the expense of representativeness and responsiveness, and I worry that creates the conditions for real political disruption down the road. There something like 40% of Canadians who have misgivings of Canadian immigration policy, and yet they can't find a voice in our mainstream politics. There's something like 25% of the population, perhaps higher, depending on the question you ask, who have misgivings about the Canadian legal system with respect to abortion. Similarly, that share of the population can't find expression or voice in our political system. And I could go down any other number of issues. And so it seems to me, one of the things we need to fundamentally grapple with is what structural or institutional changes do we need to make, including proportional representation, to ensure that our system is more representative and responsive, recognizing that that will come with trade-offs. But I think in the long run, that is the safer, more stable, and ultimately more democratic way to move forward.
But David Moskroft, if I can sort of come a bit full circle here, those numbers suggest to me, at any rate, that there is an appetite for politics, for doing democracy among members of the public, if it can be done cleaner, if it can be done more effectively, if it can give people the sense that they've got some skin in the game. However, it seems to stop, not at the river's edge, but it seems to stop at adjoining political parties. So again, we get back to this notion of whether political parties are able to change or reform themselves, or do they need to somehow be, sent the way of the dodo bird because they're just not helping?
Yeah, I think, I don't think we can get rid of them. It'd be tough for them to get rid of themselves. It's also, as we've learned, tough to get them to reform themselves. We saw Michael Chong try with the Reform Act. We saw what happened to that. I mean, there were some good bits that came of it, but largely there wasn't exactly a transformation of the party system and structure and how they operate. And we just witnessed the NDP convention, the Liberal convention, and prior to that, the Conservative convention. You saw how grassroots party democracy works. You got all kinds of different things debated, resolutions that have been adopted, some that weren't even debated. In the case of the NDP's, let's be charitable and call it a gong show. But watch and see what happens to those when they go through the party process into platforms and then perhaps, but probably not, into policy. For instance, the Liberals have been voting for basic income at their party convention since 1970. They've been in government more often than not, and yet we haven't seen anything. And there's lots of examples of that. So even internal party democracy is a sort of slow groaning machine. And so I'm not surprised when people turn around and say, well, I don't see myself in these parties, but they also don't want to be. And here's where representative democracy is good. I'm for some participatory democracy. I happen to agree with David that referenda are, for the most part, not a good mechanism. They're not the ones I prefer. They tend to be divisive. They don't lend to thoughtful engagement or participation. They make people more cynical. But when people engage constructively, you get something else. And I think that's what we need to be moving towards more than party referendums all the time, which won't do that. But I'll close off on this point. Parties want to govern, they want to stay in government, and they're going to do everything it takes to do that. But ultimately, what people want is solutions. And when you look at polling around technocracy, you find that people actually also like technocracy. They want government by experts in some cases if the experts can deliver the solutions. So the question is, how do we bridge a government that is solutions-based, but also participatory? And that's why I want to complement representative democracy with these other institutions. Because here's the thing I like about representative democracy. I don't have to be a citizen all day, every day. I don't have to be a politician all day, every day. I can read books. I can play video games. I can go walk outside. I can go to the bar when we're not in plague times. The nice thing about representative democracy is when you're not living through the panini, you get to go enjoy your life outside, provided you have the basic resources to do so. And I think those are the fundamental problems we should be solving, but complementing them with representative institutions that bring people on board a little bit too.
Well, I do want to follow up with the expert on public opinion here, which is you, Mr. Hurley, on this kind of cheeky William F. Buckley-esque question that we asked here. Remember, Buckley many, many years ago said, I'd much rather be governed by the first 100 names in the phone book than by the top 100, professors at Harvard University or something like that. And we have here Canadians, basically 2/3 of Canadians have said the same thing. They'd rather be governed by just 100 regular folks than all the experts in the world. What do you infer from that kind of result?
Well, first of all, I just want to go back and I want to say that Sean came closer than anybody ever has to giving me credit for Mr. Chrétien's decision on Iraq, and I think it's about time. So, I think those 34% of the people are 100% wrong. And I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but I might as well say something. The outgrowth of the cynicism and attitudes about politics that you've been laying out through this survey are creating a problem. And the problem that it is creating is that we are not attracting good enough people into politics anymore. And if people think that the country should be governed by the first 100 names in the phone book, they're completely wrong. It's a difficult difficult job that requires a lot of judgment and a lot of experience. And I don't think we're getting the same caliber of people we used to be. I would argue that in the middle of this Canadian pandemic, that we have had the weakest group of first ministers in my lifetime around the table to deal with it. And it's not an isolated occasion. If you try to recruit candidates now, the first thing used to be, well, how does it affect my life, or how does it affect my family? Now, everybody needs to talk about their reputation and what their families are going to go through if they run in a public sense. And so I really think, combined with the discrepancy in compensation between the private sector and the public sector and the reputation of the public sector, I think that is an emerging crisis in our country, that we're not getting good enough people.
We may be, in fact, a long way from the days of Bill Davis and Alan Blakeney and Peter Lougheed and Jean Lesage, et cetera, et cetera. Susan, I'm glad you said what you said a few weeks back, because we got a really good show out of it today. David Hurley, Sean Speer, David Moskrop, Susan Delacourt, great of all of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
2 weeks from tonight, we'll have another installment of the Democracy Agenda. And as part of this joint initiative between TVO and the Toronto Star, you can read my column on how Preston Manning would make politics better in today's Star. And that is the agenda for Thursday, April 15th, 2021. Personal care services such as barbers and hair salons are amongst the hardest hit businesses during this crisis. Tomorrow, Nan Kiwanuka finds out what they're doing to try to survive. Also, we'll hear from our Ontario hubsters on how the stay-at-home order is sitting in their parts of the province. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And Nam, we'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by viewers like you. Thank you. Looking for more of TVO's in-depth current affairs and documentaries? TVO.org/daily and sign up for our daily newsletter with links to agenda interviews, Steve Paikin's blogs, and preview our upcoming documentaries. That's all at TVO.org/daily.